Right. Well, what about the Virgin Mary in Bethlehem being the constellation Virgo? Because this is something they really hit on, also called the House of Bread. How do you deal with that? How do you answer that?
Yeah, that's another example, really, of just making up something without any documentation at all. I couldn't find anywhere, and I searched long and hard through many sources to find where the constellation Virgo was referred to as the House of Bread. Now, she is depicted in many depictions of the constellation as a young virgin holding a sheaf of wheat, or in some cases an ear of corn. But that really just has to do with, again, the seasons. You know, keep in mind that the constellations were used by ancient people to keep up with the seasons. And when Virgo rolled around, it was getting toward fall, and people realized it's time to start for the harvest. You know, and you had this idea of a virgin in the fields reaping grain, which was, of course, a very common sight in old times. As far as Virgo being identical with the Virgin Mary, I mean, that's just really a coincidence, the fact that it's a young virgin. Virgo doesn't have to refer to the type of virgin that Mary was. Just a young maiden is often the way the word's used in some cases. So again, it's this idea of imposing a very select idea onto both categories, the Virgin Mary and the constellation, in which neither one of them doesn't really fit in the big picture. The idea of the house of bread, of course, refers to Bethlehem, because the Hebrew word Bethlehem means house of bread. And that might be interesting if that house of bread idea actually applied to the constellation. Again, I can't find anything that says it does. But Bethlehem was called Bethlehem many, many hundreds of years, thousands of years actually, prior to the time of the Gospels. It didn't come out of nowhere. In fact, if I remember right, Joseph's wife, Rachel, in the Old Testament is, after she died, she is taken to Bethlehem and buried. You know, and there's this kind of interesting symbolism that one of the mothers of Israel is buried in the very place that the personification of Israel, Jesus Christ, is born. So, again, you're dealing with biblical theology. It's internally consistent. You're not dealing with astrological ideas being imposed on the Bible.
Joel, there have been some attempts by certain Christian scholars, though, who want to look at the astrological signs as a witness for Christianity. Are you familiar with this at all?
Yeah, I believe E.W. Bullinger is a popular one.
Right.
And I believe we're also talking about, was the name Seiss or Swice?
Yeah, Seiss, S-I-E-S-S. And
absolutely.
I could also throw another one in there, Dr. D. James Kennedy.
Okay,
so,
absolutely. What I think you have there, I think there's a very interesting case to be explored there. I'm not personally comfortable with accepting that wholesale. And the reason I'm not is because I've been in dialogue about this issue with my friend Danny Faulkner, who's a very strong Christian guy who happens to be an astronomer and a physicist over at the University of South Carolina. And I talked with him about this issue, and he's written some critiques of Bullinger's works and the previous ones that Bullinger worked off of. And he spots some kind of translation foibles between Bullinger's kind of translation of Arabic names and then transliterating those into Hebrew and coming up with something that happens to be meaningful. So, I mean, that's kind of technical, but you have to be careful of those things. I think in many cases Bullinger was finding things that he wanted to find in his thesis. Nevertheless, there's still a very interesting case to be made on the meaning of each constellation as a pictorial representation of the gospel. I think that's fascinating, and I think it could very well be explained as some type of a pre-flood way of knowing the gospel, of passing the proto-evangel, if you will, of the seed that would come and crush the serpent's head, the seed of the woman, given in Genesis 3:15. That was kind of a way of passing that down to the generations before there was a written Revelation. So, yeah, I think that's a great thing to be explored, but I'm a little hesitant to say, yes, this is the case.
Right. If it is true, though, it would help to explain why some pagan religions or mystery religions, instead of Christianity copying them, they're copying Christianity and the prophecies and the imagery that God naturally implanted into the universe.
Yeah, there's not a doubt about that. That would be a great aid. But as I argue in my earlier book, Manifested in the Flesh, really all you need for that is the proto-evangel itself. Genesis 3:15, the seed of the woman is going to come and crush the head of the serpent, and he'll bruise his heel. That you have that idea there. You have a son, some kind of a messianic son born to a maiden, and you have an enemy. And those three things really revolve around every myth through the mystery religions in different perverted ways, and they add on a lot to it. But that's the core of it.
Right.
So, and there's no doubt. I mean, if you read biblical Revelation, you get to Nimrod, and he lives this out in the flesh, trying to persuade people basically that he's the one that's come. He's the Messiah, and you know, a lot of those Babylonian legends were built up around that kind of life. So I think a lot of early statism and empires were built off that legend by people who were perverting it. But that's just my theory.
Well, and I think it's very valid. So you and I are on the same page as that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, let me ask you this, because when the dust of opinion settles, what you're saying, anyway, is that the Old Testament trumps all of these things as a source behind New Testament imagery. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And you brought this up earlier when you said all of the Bible was written to point to one person, and that is Christ. And I agree with that. You know, it starts right there in Genesis 3:15 we just mentioned, and it leads up to Christ. And it's very interesting because one of the issues that comes up is the early church fathers. They had to go out. They were in a situation where they were right in the midst of these pagan cultures. They were surrounded by these cults. And when they made converts, oftentimes these converts came in as former members of these cults that were practicing belief in Mithras or whatever else. And they had to hear it firsthand. And so they got all of these accusations that, well, we have a son of God, we have a virgin-born son, or we have this or we have that. And they wrote against it. And their method always, almost invariably, is to start with the Old Testament. And in fact, Justin Martyr, one of the earliest of the writers, he basically goes through all of the Old Testament in his apology and shows all of the prophecies that point to Christ. And when he gets done, he basically says, what else do we need? Why in the world would we go chasing after these pagan religions that are remotely similar when we've got such a rich heritage of prophecies of a virgin-born son, of a law-giving king, of all these, of a suffering Savior, of a dying and rising Savior, of a future resurrection hope? Why would we go after all this other stuff when we've got this rich heritage right here in the Old Testament before our eyes? So really, if you begin with Genesis 3:15, you've already trumped all this mystery religion theory. And then as you go through the Old Testament, you just keep knocking it down one time after another. And the Old Testament trumps all of those things.
Right, and you would even expect, because the way communication was done or stories were done, here you have this prophecy given to Adam and Eve, who told their children about it. In fact, I believe Eve thinks that Cain is the promised one.
Yes, definitely. I believe that his name means something to that effect, if I remember right.
Yes. And so they told their children, and they told their children, and as it got perverted, just like, in fact, it's going to lead into my next question, so I'm not going to give away the farm before I ask the question, but you would expect these myths to rise up as a perversion of the original source. And with that, let me ask you this, because I want to talk to you about the other biblical stories that Zeitgeist claims are plagiarized. What about the flood? What about the story of the birth of Moses? And you see the progression, supposedly, in the change of the lawgivers, the Manu, Minos, Mises, and then Moses, the Ten Commandments in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. How do you respond to all of that fun stuff?
Well, I think you kind of hit on it there. There's this obvious infusion of revelation in history as time goes on. When you get to Adam and Eve to begin with, when you get to Noah, and when you get to the patriarchs and Moses, you get more and more. And these guys weren't off in a valley somewhere. They weren't isolated in a vacuum. They were living their beliefs out in the midst of pagan cultures. And of course, in the case of Moses, you have these very powerful judgments literally falling out of the sky on these people, these pagan people. And of course, what are they going to take away from that? What are their children going to take away from that, the ones that live through it anyway? What are they going to take away from that? Well, they're going to have these ideas of the same ideas that Moses believed, only they're going to be perverted from a kind of a pagan way of looking at things, and that spreads out through different cultures. You have this multiplied dozens of times through different cultures and different times. So, flood is probably one of the most maligned ideas. It goes back to the common accusation that the Epic of Gilgamesh holds a very similar story, and it was obviously Gilgamesh, being a king in the 2000s BC, predates Moses by 600-800 years. So this story is older than Moses' story. In fact, it's older than some claim that Moses' story says the flood happened. But the problems with these things are just go back to the original sources. Every time, go back to the original sources. And what do you find? Well, you find out that the real sources for the Epic of Gilgamesh were actually found in total in ancient Assyria, which dates to around the 7th century BC. So as a completed flood story, you're talking about several hundred years after Moses. The earliest fragments we have of that still date to after